30 American soldiers walked into a classroom at Nha Trang. Behind them, 500,000 American troops waged war across Vietnam with helicopter gunships, B-52 bombers, and artillery that could turn jungle into moonscape. These 30 were different. They were here to learn. And standing at the front of that classroom in September 1966, an Australian sergeant looked at them with something between pity and contempt. He didn't salute. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the blackboard and wrote 2 words. "You're soft." The Americans bristled. They were paratroopers, Marines, Special Forces. They'd survived jump school, ranger training, months of combat. Soft? The Australian turned around. "You move through the jungle like you're at a parade. You smell like soap and cigarettes from 400 meters. You talk on your radios like you're ordering pizza, and you think firepower wins wars." He paused. "It doesn't. We do." This was the MACV Recondo School, the most elite training program in Vietnam, and the Australians were about to teach the most powerful military on Earth a lesson they'd never forget. Because what happened over the next 4 years, the methods these Australians taught, the philosophy they represented, would create a rift so deep that American commanders would eventually ban their own troops from observing Australian operations. The reason? Some things you can't unsee, some transformations you can't undo, and some truths about warfare are too uncomfortable for conventional armies to accept. You're about to discover why a force of barely 500 Australians achieved kill ratios the American military could never match, why the Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, and why, decades later, American Special Forces still study their methods while struggling to replicate something far more fundamental than tactics. They're trying to replicate a mindset, a philosophy, a willingness to become something that civilized society isn't supposed to produce. Stay with me. The confession nobody wanted to hear. May 1962, Canberra, Australia. The ANZUS meeting hall was quiet, except for one voice. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk stood before Australian and New Zealand delegates and made an admission that would change the course of the Vietnam War. "The United States Armed Forces," he said, "know little about jungle warfare." It was a stunning confession. America had fought in the Pacific during World War II. They'd sent advisors to Southeast Asia since the 1950s, but Rusk was honest enough to recognize what Pentagon planners were only beginning to understand. The jungle wasn't just terrain, it was a weapon, and the enemy knew how to use it better than anyone in olive drab. Australia, however, had experience. Between 1948 and 1960, Australian forces had spent 12 years fighting communist insurgents in the jungles of Malaya. They'd learned in blood what textbooks couldn't teach: how to move without sound, how to ambush without being ambushed, how to turn the green hell that killed American soldiers into an ally. The Australian government's response was immediate. In July 1962, 30 military advisors departed Sydney on a Qantas charter flight. They called themselves the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, or simply the Team. Every man had combat experience. Most had served in Malaya. Their average age was 35, a decade older than typical American soldiers, and they'd been handpicked for a single mission: teach the South Vietnamese and Americans how to survive in jungle warfare. They arrived in Saigon on July 31st, 1962, 3 years before the first American combat troops waded ashore at Da Nang. And from the very beginning, American observers noticed something different about these Australians. They didn't move like soldiers, they moved like hunters. The team dispersed across South Vietnam in small groups. Some went north to Phu Bai, others to Nha Trang. They embedded with South Vietnamese units, teaching patrol techniques, contact drills, ambush procedures. The methods they taught emphasized automatic reactions in combat, giving Vietnamese soldiers an edge over an enemy that relied on command structure. American advisors watched, and what they saw disturbed them. The Australians operated on principles that contradicted everything in U.S. Army field manuals. Small units instead of large formations, silence instead of fire superiority, patience instead of aggression, and results that made American commanders ask uncomfortable questions. By 1964, the U.S. military had a problem. They'd committed to defending South Vietnam, but they didn't know how to fight in the terrain where that defense would happen. The jungles of Vietnam weren't like the forests of Europe or the islands of the Pacific. This was triple canopy jungle, so dense that aerial reconnaissance was useless, so humid that equipment failed within weeks, so hostile that simply surviving required expertise most American units didn't possess. Meanwhile, the Australians were getting results. Vietnamese units trained by the team showed improved performance, more successful patrols, better ambush techniques, lower casualty rates, and American commanders began requesting Australian advisors for their own training programs. The request was unusual. America had more troops, better equipment, bigger budgets, but they needed what Australia had learned in a decade of jungle warfare. They needed knowledge that couldn't be rushed, couldn't be purchased, and couldn't be learned anywhere except in the green hell itself. Where ghosts are made. 100 kilometers south of Brisbane, in the McPherson Ranges of Queensland, there exists a place that has shaped jungle warriors since 1942. Canungra. The locals call it Kokoda Barracks now, but to generations of Australian soldiers, it's simply known as the place where you learn whether you belong in the jungle or whether the jungle owns you. The facility was established in November 1942, carved from rainforest terrain as hostile as any in the Pacific. Australian commanders had learned a brutal lesson in New Guinea. Troops trained in temperate climates died in tropical jungles. They needed realistic training in realistic conditions. Canungra provided both. The training regime was unforgiving. 6 days per week, 12 hours per day for 3 weeks. Then a 6-day exercise in the McPherson Range carrying your own rations, navigating by dead reckoning through terrain so dense that fire beacons had to be lit as navigational aids. Men trained under conditions as close to combat as possible. Because in jungle warfare, there's no margin for learning on the job. The physical demands were only the beginning. Canungra's instructors understood that jungle warfare was primarily psychological. Soldiers had to overcome the instinctive fear of enclosed spaces, constant dampness, invisible threats. The training deliberately induced stress to break down mental barriers, obstacle courses designed to exhaust, battle inoculation ranges with live ammunition cracking overhead, night exercises where men learned that darkness in triple canopy jungle was absolute, disorienting, and terrifying until you learned to trust other senses. Navigation training was particularly intensive. In European warfare, you had landmarks, roads, villages. In jungle warfare, everything looked the same. A soldier could walk in circles for days and never know it. Canungra taught dead reckoning, pace counting, using vegetation patterns to identify terrain features. They taught how to maintain direction when you couldn't see the sun, couldn't use a compass reliably because of magnetic anomalies, and had to trust your training over your instincts. Survival training went beyond basic fieldcraft. Students learned which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which could be used medicinally. They learned to find water in terrain that looked bone dry. They learned to build shelters that were invisible from 3 meters away. They learned to move through vegetation without disturbing it in ways that betrayed their passage. But perhaps most importantly, they learned patience. Jungle warfare rewarded those who could wait. Hours in ambush, position without moving. Days observing enemy trails without engaging. Weeks operating behind enemy lines without extraction. The training deliberately cultivated this patience through exercises that forced men to remain motionless while insects crawled over them. Rain soaked through their clothes, and every instinct screamed to move. By mid-1944, Kanungra was processing between 4,000 and 5,000 men. The curriculum constantly evolved based on after-action reports from the Pacific. Officers who'd survived Kokoda and Bougainville came back as instructors, bringing lessons written in Australian blood. The message was consistent. In the jungle, conventional tactics get you killed. These instructors taught from experience, not theory. They'd learned that noise discipline was absolute. A single cough could betray a position. That camouflage had to account for smell as well as sight. That the enemy tracked patrol routes by following disturbed vegetation and would set ambushes days after you passed through. They taught that in jungle warfare, initiative often meant death. The first patrol to fire gave away their position. The first unit to call for support revealed their location to every enemy within radio range. Victory went to those with superior patience and discipline, not superior firepower. The facility closed in 1948 after World War II ended, but in 1954, as communist insurgency erupted in Malaya, Kanungra reopened. The site expanded to over 7,700 acres. 3 sections were established, one for officer and NCO training in jungle tactics, one for unit training under jungle conditions, and one for doctrine development and manual production. Colonel Ted Sarong took command in 1955. His chief instructor was Lieutenant Colonel George Wharf, a veteran who'd earned a military cross in New Guinea and a Distinguished Service Order in Borneo. These weren't theorists. They were men who'd learned jungle warfare by surviving it, and they were about to train the generation that would go to Vietnam. The standards were brutal. Discipline was absolute. Physical fitness wasn't optional. And the underlying philosophy was simple. The jungle is neutral. It doesn't care about your nationality or your ideology. It kills those who don't understand it and protects those who do. When the first Australian units deployed to Vietnam in 1965, every man passed through Kanungra first, 3 weeks of hell before, 3 weeks of larger hell. By the time they arrived in country, Australian soldiers knew things American troops would take years to learn. How to navigate without maps, how to move without noise, how to survive on local food to avoid telltale Western rations, how to think like predators instead of soldiers. And in 1966, a new unit began training at Kanungra. 3 squadrons of the Special Air Service Regiment, rotating through on year-long deployments to Vietnam. These men would take everything Kanungra taught and refine it into something that would terrify the enemy and disturb American observers in equal measure. The SAS selection process started before Kanungra. Candidates needed specific psychological profiles, high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, exceptional pattern recognition, and something the psychologists called predatory patience. The ability to remain absolutely motionless for hours, the willingness to explode into violence after extended inactivity, the capacity to function independently when help was days away. The selection course itself was designed to break men, not physically, though the physical demands were extreme, psychologically, because SAS operations in Vietnam would require men to spend weeks alone in hostile territory, surrounded by enemy forces, operating under conditions that would drive most soldiers to break down. Candidates endured sleep deprivation, stress positions, isolation exercises. They were tested on their ability to make decisions under pressure, maintain operational security under interrogation, function effectively when every system was breaking down. The instructors weren't looking for supermen. They were looking for men with specific mental architecture that allowed them to thrive in situations that destroyed others. Only 1 in 12 candidates completed selection. Those who did entered training that lasted 18 months, 3 times longer than American Special Forces training of the same period. The training was deliberately progressive, building capabilities layer by layer. First came advanced infantry skills, weapons handling until it was automatic, navigation until they could dead reckon through featureless terrain, communications until they could maintain radio discipline under fire, field medicine until they could treat casualties without evacuation. Then came specialized skills, advanced parachute techniques, helicopter insertion and extraction, demolitions and sabotage, intelligence gathering and reporting, small unit tactics refined to the point where a 5-man patrol could engage and defeat a company-sized enemy force. But the most critical training didn't happen in military facilities at all. It happened in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down because they'd been passed down through 40,000 years of oral tradition. These instructors taught SAS candidates how to read terrain that looked empty to untrained eyes, how to identify tracks days old by moisture patterns in disturbed soil, how to smell water from kilometers away, how to predict animal and human movement by understanding the subtle relationships between terrain, vegetation, and behavior. The Aboriginal trackers brought knowledge that Western military doctrine had no framework to understand. They could track individual humans through terrain where multiple patrols had passed. They could identify specific people by their gait pattern translated into footprints. They could reconstruct entire narratives of movement and action from signs that white Australians couldn't see. This knowledge was cultural, not technical. It couldn't be taught through manuals or classroom instruction. It required immersion, observation, practice under the guidance of teachers who'd learned from teachers who'd learned through uncounted generations. SAS candidates who completed this training emerged with capabilities that seemed supernatural to those who hadn't experienced it. And critically, they emerged with a different relationship to wilderness. Most Western soldiers saw jungle as hostile environment to be endured. Aboriginal instructors taught SAS candidates to see it as neutral space that could be ally or enemy, depending on your relationship with it. This philosophical shift underpinned everything that made Australian operations effective in Vietnam. This was the foundation. This was where Australian jungle warriors were forged. And when they arrived in Vietnam, they brought something American forces had never seen, a complete integration of modern military tactics with ancient hunting methods. The first contact, May 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. First Squadron, Australian SAS, had been in country for 3 months. They'd established a base called SAS Hill at Nui Dat, a secure compound that even other Australian units weren't permitted to enter, and they'd been conducting reconnaissance patrols, 5-man teams that vanished into the jungle for days at a time. American liaison officers attached to the Australian task force watched these operations with growing curiosity. The Australians moved differently. They inserted by helicopter at treetop height with precision that made American pilots nervous. They established patrol bases without clearing vegetation or digging fighting positions. They communicated through touches instead of hand signals, and they achieved results that seemed impossible. In their first months of operation, Australian SAS patrols recorded Viet Cong movements, established ambush positions, and gathered intelligence that conventional American units couldn't obtain. But it was their first major contact with the enemy that made American observers realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. The patrol consisted of 5 men. They'd been inserted 4 days earlier in the area around Nui Dat. Their mission was simple: observe enemy movement along suspected supply routes. What happened next would be classified at the highest levels for years. The Australians had identified a trail intersection used by Viet Cong couriers. Instead of setting a conventional ambush, 4 men positioned themselves in undergrowth so dense they were invisible from 2 meters away. The 5th man, an Aboriginal tracker, examined the trail itself for 20 minutes, studying disturbed vegetation, moisture content in soil, even the smell of the air. Based on his analysis, the Australians repositioned. 11 hours later, a 3-man Viet Cong courier team walked directly into the killing zone. The engagement lasted 4 seconds, 3 enemy killed, 0 Australian casualties, 0 shots fired that could be heard beyond 50 meters. But what disturbed the American observer wasn't the tactical execution. It was what happened after. American doctrine called for immediate extraction following enemy contact. Get in, hit hard, get out. The Australians didn't extract. They remained in position for 6 more hours. At 14:30, a 7-man Viet Cong search team arrived to investigate when the couriers failed to report. They found their comrades arranged in a specific pattern, sitting upright against trees, eyes open, weapons across their laps, as if resting. And tucked into each man's collar was a playing card, the ace of spades. The psychological effect was immediate. The search team clustered together, abandoned tactical discipline, and retreated at twice the speed they'd arrived. The Australians watched it all. They didn't engage. They simply observed, as fear did more damage than bullets could have done. The American observer's classified report contained a single line that would echo through Pentagon corridors. Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare operations using enemy bodies as the primary medium. When the student becomes the teacher. By September 1966, the Pentagon had reached a conclusion. Australian methods worked. They needed to be studied, documented, and taught to American forces. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, directed the 5th Special Forces Group to establish a school dedicated to teaching long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques. The result was the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang. The name was Westmoreland's invention, combining reconnaissance, commando, and doughboy. The school would train American soldiers in small unit jungle warfare tactics, and critically, it would include Australian and Korean liaison instructors to provide expertise that American forces lacked. The first classes began with 60 students every 2 weeks. The curriculum was intensive. 3 weeks of training, including map reading, intelligence gathering, weapons proficiency, communications, and patrolling techniques. But the real education came from observing how the Australians approached jungle warfare differently than anyone else. The school operated from facilities at Nha Trang, near the massive naval and air bases that served as American strongpoints in central Vietnam. The location was deliberate. The mountainous jungle between Nha Trang and Cam Ranh Bay was enemy territory, perfect for the final exam that every student had to pass, an actual combat patrol in hostile terrain. The curriculum was structured in 3 phases. The first week focused on physical conditioning and basic skills. Students ran miles in full combat gear, building up to a 9-mile run with rifle, 6 quarts of water, 16 magazines, and a 40-pound sandbag. They completed swim tests, running 3 miles to the beach and swimming 100 meters out to a raft and back. They practiced until burn marks under their armpits and on their lower backs became the sure sign of a Recondo graduate. The instructors were among the best soldiers in the Army, triple volunteers who'd chosen Army, Airborne, and Special Forces. Many were Ranger qualified. All had combat experience, and supporting them were Australian and Korean liaison instructors who brought different perspectives on jungle warfare. 18 Australians attended Recondo School as students during its operation, but dozens more served as instructors and advisors, teaching American Special Forces the methods that had proven effective in Australian operations. And from the very first day, cultural differences emerged. The second week focused on practical exercises, rappelling from towers and helicopters, weapons training on both American and enemy weapons, because knowing how an AK-47 sounded was critical to identifying threats, mine and booby trap recognition, because the Viet Cong were masters of improvised explosives, helicopter operations, because the Huey was the primary insertion and extraction platform. Students learned stabo extraction, a technique developed by Special Forces reconnaissance teams to extract personnel from jungle where helicopter landing was impossible. They climbed rope ladders with 75 pounds of gear, learning to trust equipment and pilot skill while dangling beneath a helicopter, moving at speed through hostile territory. They practiced immediate action drills, the automatic responses to ambush that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. These drills were practiced until they became muscle memory, because in combat, thinking got you killed, reacting kept you alive. But it was in patrol techniques where Australian and American approaches diverged most dramatically. American instructors taught contact drills focused on establishing fire superiority and calling for support. Australian instructors taught avoidance techniques focused on never making contact unless absolutely necessary. American instructors emphasized radio procedure and coordination with supporting units. Australian instructors emphasized radio silence and self-sufficiency. The philosophical difference was stark. Americans tried to leverage superior resources through coordination. Australians tried to avoid needing resources through superior fieldcraft. One Recondo school graduate later recalled an Australian instructor's response when asked about calling for artillery support. "If you're calling for artillery, you've already failed. The enemy knows where you are. Your mission is compromised, and you're probably dead. Your job is to see without being seen, to move without being tracked, to kill without being found. Artillery defeats that purpose." Another cultural difference emerged in approach to enemy contact. American doctrine taught fire and maneuver, establishing fire superiority and destroying enemy forces through coordinated action. Australian doctrine taught selective engagement, psychological warfare, and breaking enemy will rather than killing enemy soldiers. One Australian instructor demonstrated this difference during weapons training. After showing American students how to employ ambush tactics, he explained, "Killing every enemy you encounter is inefficient. Bodies can't spread fear, but the right body, displayed the right way, sends a message to everyone who finds it. One message delivered correctly is worth 10 kills." The Americans were uncomfortable with this concept. It sounded like psychological warfare bordering on terrorism. The Australians' response was blunt. "You're fighting an insurgency. The enemy uses fear as a weapon. You can pretend to be civilized and lose, or you can accept that this is a different kind of war and adapt." The third and final week focused on the culminating exercise, an actual reconnaissance patrol in enemy territory. Students planned their mission, coordinated helicopter insertion, conducted the patrol, and executed extraction, all in areas where enemy contact was probable. This wasn't training, it was combat. The final exam could and sometimes did result in firefights. At least 2 students died during these patrols. Many more were wounded. Viet Cong were killed in engagements during final exercises. The school earned its nickname honestly, the deadliest school on earth. Students who completed the 3rd week successfully were graduated and authorized to wear the Recondo patch on their right breast pocket. Each received a unique Recondo number entered into their permanent military file. The honor graduate of each class received a specially engraved Recondo knife. Of the 5,626 soldiers who attended Recondo school, only 3,515 graduated, a failure rate of nearly 40%. Those who completed the course went on to serve in long-range reconnaissance patrol units, special forces, and other elite formations. They brought skills that would save their lives in the jungles of Vietnam, but even Recondo training, as intense as it was, couldn't fully replicate what Australian SAS operators achieved, because the Australians weren't just teaching tactics, they were representing a fundamentally different relationship with jungle warfare. American doctrine emphasized technology and firepower, communications gear, air support, artillery preparation. The Australians stripped away everything non-essential. One American student watched in disbelief as an Australian instructor removed the soles from standard-issue jungle boots and replaced them with strips of tire rubber cut to match Vietnamese sandal patterns. "Why?" the American asked. "Because," the Australian replied, "Vietnamese don't wear American boots, and if the enemy finds your tracks, you want them confused about who made them." It was a minor detail that represented a fundamental philosophical divide. Americans tried to dominate the environment through superior equipment. Australians tried to become part of the environment through adaptation. The training methods reflected this difference. American instructors taught contact drills focused on establishing fire superiority and calling for support. Australian instructors taught avoidance techniques focused on never making contact unless absolutely necessary. American instructors emphasized radio procedure and coordination with supporting units. Australian instructors emphasized radio silence and self-sufficiency. One Recondo school graduate later recalled an Australian instructor's response when asked about calling for artillery support. "If you're calling for artillery, you've already failed." The enemy knows where you are. Your mission is compromised, and you're probably dead. The final week of Recondo training consisted of an actual combat patrol in enemy territory. This wasn't a training exercise. It was a real mission with real danger. Between 1966 and 1970, at least 2 students died during these patrols, and many others were wounded. The school earned a grim nickname, the deadliest school on earth. Of the 5,626 soldiers who attended Recondo School, only 3,515 graduated, a failure rate of nearly 40%. Those who completed the course received a Recondo patch, a unique number entered in their permanent military file, and skills that would save their lives in the jungles of Vietnam. The honor graduate of each class received a specially engraved Recondo knife, but even Recondo training, as intense as it was, couldn't fully replicate what Australian SAS operators achieved, because the Australians weren't just teaching tactics. They were representing a fundamentally different relationship with jungle warfare. The philosophy they couldn't copy. Major James Morrison, U.S. Army, had 3 tours with MACV under his belt when he was assigned as liaison officer to the Australian Task Force in April 1968. He'd seen combat in some of the most hostile terrain in Southeast Asia. He considered himself experienced, capable, professional. On June 15, 1968, Morrison accompanied a 5-man Australian SAS patrol into the northern approaches of the Longhai Mountains. What he witnessed over the following 72 hours would lead to his immediate request for transfer back to American command. The patrol departed Nui Dat at 300 hours, moving on foot through 8 kilometers of rubber plantation before reaching the jungle fringe. Morrison noted that the Australians moved without talking, without hand signals, without any sound whatsoever. Communication happened through touches. A shoulder meant stop, an arm indicated direction. Hand signals so subtle Morrison missed half of them. By dawn, they'd covered 12 kilometers and established position overlooking a trail intersection. The Australians didn't dig fighting positions. They didn't establish fields of fire. 4 men melted into undergrowth on either side of the trail, while the 5th, an Aboriginal tracker named Private Dorian Walker, moved forward to examine the path itself. Walker was Pentubi, from the western desert region of Australia. He'd been recruited through a program the Australian government officially denied existed. His people had survived for 40,000 years in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments by developing sensory capabilities that Western science struggled to explain. For 20 minutes, Walker studied the trail. He lowered his face to within centimeters of the ground. He sniffed the air. He touched vegetation with his fingertips, feeling for moisture content that would indicate how recently someone had passed. Morrison watched, fascinated and disturbed in equal measure. Walker returned and communicated something to the patrol leader in a whisper so soft Morrison couldn't hear it, despite being less than 2 meters away. The Australians began repositioning, with movements so slow they seemed geological. They were predicting where the enemy would be based on signs Morrison couldn't see. Morrison's classified after-action report attempted to explain what he'd witnessed. The Australian method does not rely on technology or superior firepower. It relies on achieving cognitive superiority over the enemy through environmental mastery and psychological manipulation. They do not seek to destroy the enemy through force. They seek to terrorize the enemy into inaction through demonstration of capabilities that seem supernatural. The report continued. American military doctrine assumes that wars are won by killing more of the enemy than they kill of you. Australian doctrine assumes that wars are won by making the enemy too frightened to fight. This fundamental difference in philosophy produces fundamentally different results. Morrison concluded with a personal note that was immediately classified. I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. What I witnessed was effective but incompatible with American values regarding the conduct of warfare. Other American observers reached similar conclusions. Australian SAS operators didn't just move through the jungle, they became part of it. They stopped using soap days before insertion to eliminate Western scents. They switched their diet to rice, fish sauce, and local vegetables, so their sweat smelled Vietnamese. They removed boot soles and walked on canvas shoes or bare rubber to leave tracks that matched local footprints. But the most disturbing adaptation was psychological. The Australians approached jungle operations with an emotional register that American soldiers found alien. Where Americans displayed anxiety or frustration in the bush, Australians appeared comfortable, almost proprietary. They moved through hostile territory the way a farmer moves through his own field, with familiarity, confidence, and complete ownership. One American Green Beret who trained with Australian SAS described the experience. They didn't see the jungle as the enemy's weapon, they saw it as their weapon, and watching them operate, you realized they were right. The jungle wasn't trying to kill them. It was hiding them, feeding them, protecting them. They'd made a deal with it somehow. The numbers that couldn't be denied: between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols in Vietnam. The statistics from those operations tell a story that Pentagon analysts studied for decades. Casualties: 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded, enemy killed, over 600 confirmed, with many more probable. Kill ratio exceeding 30-1 in some operations, with an overall ratio that far surpassed any other unit in Vietnam. These weren't just numbers. They represented a level of operational effectiveness that American forces, despite vastly superior resources, never matched. And the disparity created friction at every level of command. American conventional infantry averaged kill ratios around 1-1. Even elite American units with full air support and artillery rarely exceeded 7-1. The Australian SAS was achieving ratios that seemed impossible without understanding their methods. The difference wasn't equipment. Australians carried older weapons than Americans. Their communications gear was a generation behind. They operated without the helicopter support, artillery coordination, and airstrikes that American units considered essential. The difference wasn't training duration. While Australian SAS training lasted 18 months compared to American Special Forces training of 6 to 8 months, plenty of American soldiers received extensive training without achieving similar results. The difference was philosophical. Americans measured success in bodies counted and territory seized. Australians measured success in enemy operations disrupted and psychological dominance achieved. Americans sought to win through superior firepower. Australians sought to win through superior fear. Viet Cong operational logs, captured after the war, revealed the psychological impact of Australian operations. Entry from November 3, 1968. 3 comrades failed to return from water collection. Search found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of contact. Entry from November 7th. Sentry Position 4 reported presence in jungle at 0200. Flare illumination revealed nothing. Sentry found at dawn, throat cut. No sound heard by adjacent positions 15 meters away. Entry from November 12th. Movement restricted to daylight hours only. Commander requests reinforcement. Request denied. Area considered secure from American operations. The Viet Cong had developed extensive experience fighting Americans. They knew American patterns, American capabilities, American limitations, but they couldn't predict Australian operations, couldn't counter Australian tactics, and most troubling, couldn't understand how Australians moved through hostile territory without being detected. The enemy gave the Australian SAS a name, Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and in Viet Cong-held areas where Australian patrols operated, soldiers began conducting spiritual rituals before entering the forest. They believed they were fighting something supernatural. One former Viet Cong commander interviewed after the war put it simply, "Worse than the Americans were the Australians. The American style was to hit us, then call for planes and artillery. We could handle that. The Australians were patient, silent, everywhere and nowhere. Fighting them was like fighting the jungle itself." Where doctrine meets reality. By 1967, the Pentagon was attempting to replicate Australian success through American programs. Long-range reconnaissance patrol units were established across Vietnam. American soldiers attended Recondo school by the hundreds. Tactics were studied, documented, and distributed through training manuals. But something was missing. American LRRP units achieved respectable results, but never approached Australian effectiveness. The tactics could be copied, the equipment could be replicated, but the underlying philosophy remained foreign to American military culture. The problem was institutional. American military doctrine in the 1960s was built on World War II experience. Superior industrial capacity, overwhelming firepower, conventional maneuver warfare. These approaches had crushed the Wehrmacht and Imperial Japan. They represented the foundation of American military identity. But Vietnam wasn't a conventional war, and the Viet Cong weren't a conventional enemy. They didn't mass for decisive battle. They didn't hold territory. They didn't provide targets for American firepower. Instead, they dispersed, concealed, and waited for American forces to expose themselves. Against such an enemy, American doctrine struggled. More troops didn't help because the enemy avoided contact. More firepower didn't help because there were no targets. More technology didn't help because the jungle defeated sensors and aerial reconnaissance. Australian doctrine emerged from different experience: colonial policing, small wars, frontier survival, the Boer War, the Malayan emergency, the Indonesian confrontation. In each conflict, Australian forces learned that patience, fieldcraft, and psychological manipulation achieved results that firepower couldn't. One American officer who observed Australian operations extensively wrote in a classified assessment, "The Australians have rediscovered something we forgot. War is not about technology or firepower. It is about men who are willing to become something less than civilized to survive. They have become predators. We are still thinking like soldiers." The assessment identified the core issue. American military culture emphasized civilization, order, and overwhelming force. Australian SAS culture emphasized adaptation, patience, and psychological warfare that deliberately targeted enemy morale through fear. These approaches weren't just different, they were incompatible. and attempts to merge them produced confusion rather than capability. American soldiers trained in Australian tactics often reverted to American doctrine under stress. They called for artillery when Australians would have remained silent. They maneuvered for fire superiority when Australians would have avoided contact entirely. They thought in terms of destroying the enemy when Australians thought in terms of terrifying the enemy. The Australian approach required accepting uncomfortable truths about warfare. That killing isn't always optimal. That fear is more powerful than casualties. That psychological dominance matters more than territorial control. And that effective warriors aren't always model citizens. These truths violated American cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought. Clean, honorable, decisive. The Australian approach was none of those things. It was patient, psychological, and designed to break enemy morale through methods that made American observers uncomfortable. The legacy, written in silence. In 1970, General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as commander of American forces in Vietnam, made a controversial decision. He closed the MACV Recondo school in December of that year. The official reason was changing operational priorities. The unofficial reason was more complex. Recondo School had succeeded in training over 3,500 graduates who brought improved reconnaissance capabilities to American forces. But it had also exposed a gap that American military culture couldn't bridge. The Australians operated from a philosophical foundation that American soldiers could observe but not internalize. Some American officers argued for expanding Australian-style training. Others argued that such methods were incompatible with American values and should be avoided. The institutional response was typically bureaucratic. Acknowledge the effectiveness, document the tactics, but don't fundamentally challenge the doctrine. Meanwhile, Australian forces were preparing to withdraw from Vietnam. The first reductions came in November 1970, when 8RAR completed its tour and wasn't replaced. By January 1973, Australian combat involvement had ceased. They'd committed nearly 60,000 personnel over a decade. 521 were killed. More than 3,000 were wounded. The Australian SAS returned home to a country that didn't understand what they'd done or how they'd done it. Unlike World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans faced public opposition and even discrimination. Some RSL clubs, organizations for returned soldiers, initially refused to recognize Vietnam as a real war. The men who'd learned to hunt humans in Vietnamese jungles struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. Private Dorian Walker, the Aboriginal tracker whose abilities had amazed American observers, returned to Australia in 1970 and never served in the military again. He spent his remaining years in the Western Desert, living among his people, never speaking about Vietnam. When researchers attempted to interview him, he refused. "That knowledge belongs to the jungle," he reportedly said. "It stays there." The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations wasn't completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. Classified top secret and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted American military doctrine. First, small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. Second, indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Third, psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. Fourth, and most controversially, Australian methods achieved these results while operating under significantly fewer restrictions than American forces. The classified annex noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely violate standing directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. This final point ensured the report remained classified for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing that their most effective allies had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. What cannot be taught today, special operations forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam. The tracker programs, the psychological operations, the long-range patrol doctrine have all been incorporated into modern special forces training. What was once too controversial to acknowledge is now standard curriculum, but something has been lost in translation. Modern special operations can replicate Australian tactics. They struggle to replicate Australian psychology. The transformation that turned sheep farmers and desert trackers into jungle phantoms. The willingness to become something other than conventional soldiers. The acceptance that effective hunting requires becoming a hunter in your soul, not merely in your training. The Australian experience in Vietnam demonstrated that small numbers of highly trained personnel, operating from fundamentally different philosophical assumptions, could achieve results that vast conventional forces could not. But it also demonstrated the cost of such operations on the individuals who conduct them. The men who became Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, learned to think like predators, and predators don't easily return to the herd. The same adaptations that made them devastating in combat made them incompatible with civilian life. They'd crossed a line that most soldiers never approach, let alone cross. American observers in Vietnam recognized this distinction. They saw the effectiveness. They documented the tactics. They attempted to replicate the results. But most understood at some level that what the Australians had achieved required a transformation that American military culture wasn't willing to accept. Because at its core, the Australian approach demanded something uncomfortable: the recognition that effective warfare isn't always honorable warfare. That victory doesn't always come through superior virtue or better values. That sometimes winning requires becoming the thing you're fighting against, not in ideology, but in ruthlessness, patience, and willingness to use fear as a weapon. The American military has never fully resolved this tension. It wants the effectiveness of unconventional warfare without the moral complexity that unconventional warfare demands. It wants elite operators who can achieve Australian-level results while maintaining American-level restraint. It wants warriors who can flip a psychological switch, becoming predators on deployment and citizens at home without the transformation affecting their souls. The Australian experience in Vietnam suggests this is impossible, that you cannot teach someone to hunt humans effectively without changing who they are fundamentally, that the skills which make someone devastatingly effective in combat are precisely the skills that make someone incompatible with peaceful society. This is the lesson American observers witnessed in Vietnamese jungles between 1966 and 1971. This is why some requested transfers after observing Australian operations. This is why the most comprehensive reports on Australian methods remained classified for decades, not because the tactics were secret, but because the implications were uncomfortable. The question that remains, in that classroom at Nha Trang in September 1966, when an Australian sergeant wrote, "You're soft" on the blackboard, he wasn't insulting American soldiers. He was stating a fundamental truth about different approaches to warfare. American forces were soft in the sense that they maintained connections to civilian values. They relied on technology to avoid personal contact with the enemy. They called for artillery to avoid close combat. They operated in large units to avoid individual vulnerability. These weren't weaknesses, they were deliberate choices about how to fight while maintaining humanity. Australian SAS operators made different choices. They accepted vulnerability to achieve stealth. They accepted isolation to achieve surprise. They accepted transformations to achieve effectiveness. And they paid for those choices with parts of themselves they could never recover. The American military observed this and made a decision. They would learn from Australian tactics. They would improve their small unit capabilities. They would develop better reconnaissance techniques. But they would not fundamentally change their philosophical approach to warfare. This wasn't failure. It was a conscious choice about values and identity, about what kind of military America wanted to field, and what kind of warriors America wanted to create, about accepting slightly lower effectiveness to maintain connection between military and civilian culture. The Australians made a different choice. They created a warrior culture that achieved extraordinary results at extraordinary personal cost. They proved that small numbers of properly trained personnel could dominate terrain and enemy that vast conventional forces could not, and they demonstrated that such dominance required becoming something that civilized society struggles to accommodate when the war ends. Decades later, the question remains unanswered. Can you create effective unconventional warriors without fundamentally transforming them in ways that make reintegration impossible? Can you teach someone to hunt humans without making them a hunter permanently? Can you achieve Australian-level results with American-level restraint? The Australian SAS in Vietnam proved what's possible when restraint is abandoned in favor of effectiveness. The American response to Australian methods proved what's chosen when effectiveness conflicts with values. And the lives of men like Dorian Walker proved the cost when transformation is complete. That Australian sergeant in 1966 was right. The Americans were soft, but soft isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes it's the choice to remain human even when inhumanity might prove more effective. Sometimes it's the decision that some victories aren't worth the cost they demand from those who achieve them. The Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved kill ratios that may never be matched. They terrified an enemy that had learned not to fear American firepower. They demonstrated capabilities that still inspire special operations forces around the world, and they paid for those achievements with pieces of themselves that no amount of training or doctrine can prepare soldiers to lose. This is their story, not a tale of superior warriors, but a demonstration of different choices and different costs. A reminder that effectiveness and humanity exist in tension, and that every military must decide for itself which matters more. The jungle ghosts of Vietnam proved what's possible when that choice favors effectiveness above all else. The American response proved what's protected when that choice favors humanity despite the cost. And somewhere between those positions lies the eternal question every nation must answer. What kind of warriors do we want to create? And what kind of people do we want them to remain?